Why did the passengers that got off at this abandoned station never have a return ticket? And what does this square have in common with a Hollywood film set? Find out now on episode 20 of Astonishing Glasgow. For this episode, I've cycled over to Graham's Square off the Gallowgate to explore what remains of Glasgow's old meat market and abattoir. But don't worry, this video is 100% vegetarian and no animals were hurt in its making. The meat market moved to this site in 1817, but most of what remains is from a redevelopment of the site around 1879. We might as well start here in Graham's Square, because I'm here already, so it makes sense. Beyond the market clock was the entrance to the livestock pens and the cattle market, and this building on the right was the market inn. I feel like I've ended up in someone's garden, so I better go back out onto the square. This grand building to the left was the entrance to what maps of the time call the dead meat market, so it's fairly obvious what they sold in there. Inside this building was a huge covered market, with butchers' stalls selling cuts of meat that have come straight from the abattoir. This picture from around 1911 shows slaughtermen and porters milling around in the square, and if you look to the left of the clock, you can see the same set of ladders are still propped up against the arch today. There are some really nice surviving details on this building, but if I wander back down the cobbled street, you can see what it has in common with a Hollywood film set. The building is nothing more than a wall, with a new housing development tacked on behind. It is nice that they have saved the front, but it must be weird living in those new flats if the only view out your window is the back of this wall. This is a really quiet square now, but it must have been a real hive of activity when the market was in operation. Even more so twice a year when the feeing market took place. Usually in May and November, thousands of farm workers would head to this point in Glasgow in the hope of employment for the coming season. The practice slowly ended after World War I. I'm going to circle the site in a clockwise direction. So back down onto the Gallowgate and the next surviving part of the site on Moore Street. It's very easy to instantly hate new housing developments, but from my brief view of this development, it looks quite nice. Certainly, the Royal Institute of British Architects liked it enough to give it an award in 2009. How great are these big sandstone arches? Probably constructed of Giffnock stone, which, if you look up there, there's a link to my Giffnock stone video. And it's really nice to see the animal carvings at the top. Round the corner now and into Melbourne Street, and the development suddenly gives way to derelict land. These plots had everything from market offices, pubs, housing, paint manufacturers and a confectionery works. So I don't imagine it would ever have been quiet here, with workers, horses and carts, trucks and animals coming and going. The smell must have been pretty spectacular as well. Moving up Melbourne Street, this area would have been home to all the market slaughterhouses. But with them all gone, you get a great view of the B-listed cattle market sheds. These sheds would have been full of animal pens, where the livestock would have been traded, but in January 1919 they stored something very different. At the end of World War I, thousands of men returned from the front only to find there were no jobs for them. The trade unions called for changes to the working week to give more people employment, but when these requests were refused, the 40-hour strike broke out, with thousands of workers downing tools and gathering in George Square. Such was the panic in the government of the time, a meeting was called at the War Cabinet, the armed forces were put on standby, and the meat market sheds found themselves hosting 12,000 soldiers and 6 tanks as shown in this picture. On the 31st of January 1919, with 20 to 25,000 men gathering, the Battle of George Square broke out between police and strikers. And this is the astonishing sight of British tanks making their way down Gallowgate and past the Trongate to be deployed against British civilians. Thankfully, Cam returned to the city with no fatalities, and by February the 12th the strike was over. So back to Melbourne Street and over the railway bridge to the next remaining building, although there is not much left of it now. This was another slaughterhouse and abattoir, but these were originally run by Glasgow City Council, and the gates still have their coat of arms proudly displayed on them. I think it's amazing these haven't been stolen for scrap or put in a museum. They deserve to be saved. I've now made my way onto Duke Street, a stone's throw from the city centre, and to the last part of the site to stop operating as an abattoir and slaughterhouse. The abattoir on this site was a more modern building. It was rebuilt in the 70s, and it only ceased trading in 2001, shortly after that year's foot and mouth disease outbreak. The abattoir buildings were demolished in 2007, only leaving this small entrance, and the land lay empty until 2020, when work began to transform the area into a huge new housing development, described by the builders as a contextually sensitive interpretation of tenement blocks, don't you know? Look like blocks of flats to me. We are now leaving Duke Street and heading down Belgrove Street, and I'm really surprised this sign has survived. At this entrance to the cattle market, we get another distinctive gate, as well as somebody's shrines to Whitney, Sean, Amy and caramel wafers. Your guess is as good as mine. This was the last part of the site to be used for businesses. For several years, the sheds were used as a car auction, and when that closed, there was a car dealership using this area up until very recently. If we poke our heads over the wall, we can see the railway station that had no ticket office. This area had a platform specifically for cattle trains that allowed for livestock to arrive by train and be walked straight into the sheds. This didn't always go to plan, however. There were often times where livestock would escape, and in one such event in 1970, a newspaper reported that locals looked on from pub doorways as police chased a bullock down Gallowgate before it escaped onto Duke Street railway station, much to the surprise of the signalmen at Belgrove. With a short cycle past the sheds, we are back in Graham Square. Sadly, I am again finishing a video that proves Glasgow has a habit of letting its heritage rot. Hopefully the sheds will find a use in amongst the new flats that will allow us to all be able to visit them, but who knows. Thank you very much for joining me in this episode. If you enjoyed it and you want to see more, stick around to the end for links to more of my videos, and click that like and subscribe button to be notified when the next episode appears. Check the video description for ways to get in touch, and see you next time in Astonishing Glasgow.